Our next form of writing is one which we've already touched on before. And we touched on it particularly when we were looking at hymns and songs. Because, of course, hymns and song is really just a poem put to music. A poem that follows particular rules. So it's got meter rules and it's got rhyming rules. That's usually part of the concept of a hymn or a song. But of course, the Bible is filled with another form of writing which is called poetry. Poetry. Now, poetry particularly comes out in the writings of the prophets, especially the latter prophets, so people like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and then some of the minor prophets, places like people like Amos and Hosea and so on. And we're going to be dealing with them in a later module. But when you look at their writing or the form of writing that they use, it's a form called poetry. And in fact, the poetry part of that is an oracle. An oracle or a saying that comes from God. So something where they say, the word of the Lord came to me and he said. And that's an oracle. But often when he speaks in a form which is poetic or poetry. Now, I don't know about you, but I never did very well with poetry at school. I didn't like poetry. I liked science. I liked facts. And of course, when my teacher began to try and teach us poetry, what I realized was that poetry has got nothing to do with facts. What poetry has to do with is the concept of symbolism. Symbolism. And so when we read a piece of poetry, we would be told, well, that word, even though it means this now, actually in that context doesn't mean that at all. It means something else. It stands for something else. Effectively, it is what is called a metaphor. A metaphor. Something that stands for something else, or at least represents something else. Or it's a simile. It says, your smile lights up the room. Well, of course, when someone comes in, they might have a nice smile, but it's never going to light up a room. And so what you need to realize about that is that that's a symbolic method of saying that you have a wonderful smile. If you look at the Bible, you realize that many of the books of the Tanakh have got poetry at its heart. Now, for people like me, that will always therefore be hard work. I always have to have time to sit down and to think, well, what is it that the writer's trying to say? But I need to tell you that, in fact, the problem with poetry and metaphor is that it's completely contextual. That means that, in fact, to understand symbolism, you have to understand the context in which that symbol originates. That much of the Old Testament is written over a period of 1,000 years. Now, if it's 1,000 years, you can imagine that things changed over that period. They changed in terms of the location where they lived, the way in which they were living, the things that meant more to them. All those things would change. Now, we can see this, for example, in Genesis chapter 2, where we have a creation story. And it says that God creates mankind from the dust of the earth. In fact, the word dust from the earth is more of a King James version. In fact, the better understanding of that is that God made mankind from, or in fact Adam, from the fertile part of the soil. You see already there's a symbol there. It's not just dust, it's not just the stuff that flies around, but rather that the Hebrew word that's used is the word which says that God made it from the part of the soil which you can grow things out of. So almost in a sense that God grew mankind, or grew Adam, and of course Adam is really another word for mankind, rather than just a man or just a male, comes out of that fertile part. Almost that man was made out of that part to become fertile, to actually add something to the world. Now, you see how just knowing that Hebrew word means that changes the symbolic understanding of that particular passage. Now, that's the same thing that would be the case in Ezekiel. That would be the same thing that would be the case in Isaiah and Jeremiah. But each of those people are also writing within a particular context. Ezekiel is writing from Babylon, which means that the imagery, that the symbols that he's using, he's drawing from his context. And his context is the context of Babylon, which is why when you read Ezekiel, it has got a much more much more symbolic space. It's a much more kind of supernatural book or supernatural prophecy than, for example, Jeremiah. When we read Jeremiah, it's a much more earthy, much more grounded concept. But of course, Jeremiah was writing in the death throes of Judah, and he was writing from Jerusalem. So he was looking around him and seeing the destruction. He was seeing around him and seeing the apathy, was seeing the fact that people were following after other gods, not just Yahweh. Now you need to realize, therefore, that when you're trying to interpret prophecy, it is cultural. And you need to understand both culture and context if we are to really unravel poetry properly. And when you think about it, so much of the Tanakh is written in poetry. A quick way to figure out whether something is poetry or whether it is prose or narrative is the way in which modern Bibles actually print them. In a modern Bible, if you look through the book of Isaiah, you'll see that there's some sections which have a ragged margin. And the ones with a ragged margin we can think of as poetry. And the ones with a margin which is straight, what they call a connected margin or a justified margin, that margin is what we can call prose or narrative. So when you look at poetry again, always remind yourself that the poetry that you're reading is both contextual, so we need to say, well, what was the context of it? And it is cultural, saying, how do I understand the elements of the words in that poetry from a Jewish, from an Israelite perspective? Only when we do that can we truly begin to unravel what the stories are about, what the poetry is trying to impart to us, and what it's trying to elicit from us. Feelings of maybe connections with feelings or with thinking or with action. Effectively, poetry takes time. Poetry takes effort. And particularly, poetry takes knowledge of context and culture.